Okay, so our last two things we want to talk about are philosophy and literature. So like I said, Hellenistic philosophy is pretty similar to Hellenistic religion in terms of it's all about trying to figure out how to be less stressed, how to deal with the fact that everything is so chaotic and uncertain, and how to, in a way, find kind of inner peace. That's what this kind of philosophy focuses on. So before we had philosophy that was basically science, or we had philosophy that was trying to figure out, how should we build the perfect society? This philosophy is getting back to the individual and saying, how should we live our lives on an individual level? And one of the ways to do that is to find a kind of peace. So there's three big philosophies I want to mention in the course of this. The first is Epicureanism. So Epicureanism is a philosophy about happiness. You might have heard someone use the word Epicurean to mean like self-indulgent or like pleasure-seeking. That's not really what the Epicureans were. Later on, they got stereotyped as being all about pleasure-seeking, self-indulgent type of people because they said happiness is the most important thing in life. But I think we all kind of agree that happiness is important. They actually thought that the way to find happiness was to be very restrained. Happiness was self-control, choosing to do very specific things that were going to make you happy. Like if you sit around eating cake all day, that might be fun at first, but it's actually going to, make you feel kind of sick after a little while. The Epicureans recognized this, and so they were very careful with what they ate, what they drank, what they, how they lived their lives. They wanted to manage it so they would genuinely be happy. That's the sort of emotional side of the Epicureans. They said, self-indulgence isn't really happiness if it just leads to pain. And their founder was a guy named Epicurus. That's where we get the name from. But in addition to like the emotional side of Epicureanism, there's also a sort of scientific side of it, which is that they continue the philosophy of Democritus, which was that everything is just stuff. Sorry. Everything is stuff, and it's made out of atoms. That, we only have atoms, and we don't have like they don't believe in souls. They're skeptical about the existence of an afterlife. They think, people just die and then that's it. And if the gods might exist, but they're not that important to human life. And so death is not a scary thing. It's a positive thing, or it just a neutral thing, because it's just nothing. And one of the cool things about Epicureans is that they were very friendly towards women and towards the lower classes. They seem to have been really, popular among them. And so, they would take them in their sort of philosophical groups. So it was a pretty open-minded movement that was all about, how to understand the universe and how to be happy. And so one of their things was, if you know that you don't have to worry about the gods, then that reduces your worry quite a lot. And the other aspect of it was self-control. Another one is Stoicism. Stoicism was founded by Zeno. And there's a kind of Greek building called a stoa. It's basically a porch. And that's where he gave his lectures. He would just be out in public and just hanging around there and be talking to people about his philosophy. And so they called it Stoicism. And if we say someone is stoic, what does that tend to mean? The sort of standard way to interpret that is like a stoic person is one who doesn't show a lot of emotion, who is, not very affected by things. That's kind of like what they were talking about. Their idea was that the way to find peace was to let go of your passions and, your emotions. And so you would have clear judgment by letting go of the passions. This is called apatheia, but it doesn't quite mean the same as apathy. It just means sort of kind of calmness that comes from letting go of these things. And in some ways, it reminds me a lot of the Buddhists who we're going to look at later on. That the wise man is someone who is immune to suffering because he just kind of lets it wash over him, just roll off his back. And the Stoics said all evil is an error in judgment. So you find your own peace even when the world is crazy. That's how you do it. They also had some interesting ideas about the creation of the universe. They thought that maybe it was all the creation of one great mind. And later on, people started to compare this idea to God. And then the last school I want to look at is cynicism. So when we say someone is cynical, what does that mean? It kind of means they're suspicious, kind of means they think things are bad and they don't have a lot of hope for the world. That is not quite what's meant by cynicism, but the founder of cynicism, a guy called Diogenes, was pretty cynical in certain ways. He was very skeptical of society, let's say that. Basically, he just rejected society. He said, society is bad. It corrupts us. It makes us bad people. We are all sort of ruined by society. So let's do what comes naturally instead. So he didn't have a house. He was said to live in like a giant jar on the street, and he would go around begging for coins and peeing on the street like a dog. So the name cynic actually means dog-like. He would kind of live a bit like an animal because he didn't trust society very much. He was one of the folks who said, I am a citizen of the world, not just of Greece or not just my particular city. I am a cosmopolitan. He was a wild character. He would do things like he would go around carrying around a lamp in the middle of the day, and people say, what are you doing? Why do you need a lamp? And he says, oh, I'm looking for an honest man. I haven't found one yet. Can you find one for me? Stunts like that. Another story, which is probably not true, but is a great story, is that one time he met Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great says, Diogenes, I am the most powerful man in the world. What can I do for you? And Diogenes says, get out of the way. You're blocking the sun. And Alexander goes away feeling very satisfied and says, if I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes. So the Cynics were a bit of an obscure school because not everybody wanted to reject society, but they did have their followers for anyone who was kind of counterculture. He felt, they felt and he felt that if you were free from society, you were free from ignorance. So you wouldn't get caught up in everybody else's nonsense. You would just be your own individual. But they did kind of group up to be rejecting society together. Okay, so maybe we can see some of the similar themes as the religion. This idea of everything is scary. How do we live our lives when things are weird and we don't necessarily trust society, don't trust the old set of values? What's the new set of values going to be? And they gave lots of different answers. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is Hellenistic literature. So if we look at things so far, there's, especially in art, there's kind of been this movement between like taking the old stuff and like, continuing on from there. And on the other hand, you've got kind of rejection of the old stuff and saying, no, we want to do something different. That in a big way is what we see in Hellenistic literature, these two sort of motions. Remember that the Library of Alexandria had literature as well. And so there's a big emphasis on all this literary activity and this valorization, this worship almost of the classic authors like Homer and the playwrights like Aristophanes and Euripides, but especially Homer, who was considered kind of godlike. In fact, in one image that we have here, we have this plaque that shows Homer being sort of made into a god. He's being led by the muses, these goddesses of inspiration, to go hang out with Zeus up here and all the other gods. This shows, and this comes from Egypt, comes from Alexandria, where they really were worshiping him quite a lot, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively of worshiping him. And they would also, edit the works, try and find what's the best version of the work, because we have lots of different versions. Okay, which is the true Homer? I think these days we'd say it's all of them, but they were trying to edit and trying to find the best version. So that's the reverent side. On the sort of rejection side, we have a guy called Callimachus. Now, he was one of these authors, one of these librarians, actually. He was, we think, the guy who was responsible for the official catalog of all the literary works. But he was his own kind of writer, and he rejected the stuff that Homer had done. Forget doing giant epic poems that are really, really long. Callimachus had a famous quote, which was, "Big book, big evil. Make a biblion, make a kakon." And so he thought all this kind of epic stuff and the old style plays and all that, he thought that that was played out. And so, writers like him should do something new and do something different. So here's the kind of thing he would do. He would write stories about, just ordinary people living their lives. One of his stories is just this moment from the story of Theseus. But it's his poem called Hecale. and it's just a long poem about her life. Theseus appears, but it's all about this random old lady instead of being about Theseus. That's pretty different from what people would do before. It reminds me of the statues, like the statue of the old woman in the market. Now we're interested in random old people and ordinary lives and not just in the gods. Another guy who did something very different was Apollonius. Apollonius wrote a book called the Argonautica, which was an epic poem like the Odyssey or the Iliad. But in his story, the heroes are kind of goofy. Like Hercules, or Heracles as he's known to the Greeks, he's just a dumb brute. He's very silly. He's very much the comic relief, which is not the way people treated Heracles previously. And so he tells the story of Jason and the Argonauts, but it's all kind of silly and over the top. He also incorporates a lot of the new knowledge that Greeks have about other cultures. And so he kind of leads his heroes around on this world tour, having this kind of fun adventure, exploring places that the Greeks were getting more familiar with. In terms of plays, there's really only one playwright that people talk about during this time period, and this is Menander. Menander is the only surviving author of new comedy. We had Aristophanes, who was like the old style of comedy. Menander's new comedy takes things in a different direction. Like most people, Aristophanes was writing a lot about the gods. Menander, basically, he invents the sitcom. He writes stories. His plays are comedies about families and the silly things that happen to them, instead of about heroes and gods. So he's got characters like the cranky old man character. He's got the slave that's trying to always get the better of his masters, who's depicted as kind of dumb and greedy, but also kind of clever and enterprising at the same time. It's weird. He's got, the couple in love, the, romantic lead, so it could be a bit of a rom-com. And he's got the soldier who thinks he's, the best, and is bragging all the time. These become like standard types of characters that you see over and over again in Greek plays. And they even last into Roman plays, which is another reason why I think this time period is so important to think about, and not just the Romans, is that these guys invented this concept of having these standard characters and these standard plots. So he's got some fun storylines. Sometimes, things get turned upside down, but it all ends happily ever after. That it's kind of the style of story. If you ever see any Italian commedia dell'arte, that's really based on this kind of stuff. And finally, I want to mention that in addition to inventing the rom-com, the Hellenistic age basically invented the romance novel. What becomes really popular are these love stories. One of the most famous being one called Daphnis and Chloe, in which there's this boy and this girl who, kind of grew up together, and they were in love pretty quickly, and then they were kidnapped by pirates and sold into slavery, which, happens sometimes. That's the interesting thing, is that would happen sometimes. There are pirates who are trying to capture people and sell them into slavery. But in this story, we're rooting for this couple, so we want to see them get back together, get back together and, overcome the obstacles in their way. These are a little bigger than your standard romance novel these days, no having to escape slavery in today's modern novels. But these romance stories are really quite fun. And they're kind of the invention of the novel. They're kind of light and breezy. They're not epic poems. They're not short poems. They're kind of something in between. And they're not even poems. They're just stories, which is pretty cool. And so there's quite a lot of these during this time period, which are quite popular. And they have a little bit of an influence on later authors, like Shakespeare was drawing from one for Romeo and Juliet, only he chose to make it tragic instead of everything ending happily ever after. Because, they do get back together if they do escape slavery, so it all turns out okay. But yeah, we're seeing, I think the Hellenistic period is important because it really is an influence on a lot of the things that we still value today. As the first discovery, a lot of these things, whether that's, the romantic novel or, the nature of anatomy, all of this is coming from this time period, which is so creative and so full of interesting new ideas and taking bold new directions. And these themes that we see here really speak to the nature of the time period, and also just the sheer creativity of the time period and abundance of the time period, where there was lots of war, but lots of trade, lots of suffering, but lots of new opportunities as well. And so I would say for you guys, don't feel like you have to remember every single little thing from here. But if you want to remember something from the Hellenistic area, remember these themes. Remember, you know, what these guys are trying to convey. I would say know the names of the big philosophies, because those, you know, they have their own individual identity, and you know what's the difference between them. But most of the rest of this, just, you know, examples of science and examples of this sort of Baroque over the top art style that the Romans hated, and these themes of, you know, suffering and change, and moving from gods to people, and continuing our knowledge of the universe and how to investigate that. If you have some examples in the back of your head of those themes, you know, pick one of your favorites to really focus on. That would be what you should remember from the Hellenistic period. Okay, that's all I can think of for today. So to get you guys started on that kind of thinking, I'm going to have the discussion question be about the themes of the Hellenistic world and what examples of those themes you see. All right, thanks for being here, guys, and watching all these videos. There's certainly a lot to talk about. I'll see you on Tuesday for Romans.